The first time the HOA told me they owned my father's lake, I honestly thought it was a joke. Then they handed me a violation notice. It said I was prohibited from accessing the shoreline without HOA approval. I read it twice. Then I looked out at the lake. The same lake my father had owned for more than 30 years. The same lake where I had learned to fish as a kid. The same lake where my father used to sit every Sunday morning with a coffee in one hand and an old fishing rod in the other. And now, according to the HOA, it belonged to them. I knew they were wrong, but I didn't yet know how badly they were wrong. My father had purchased the property long before the surrounding neighborhood existed. Back then, there were only fields, woods, and an old dirt road leading to the water. Over the years, houses were built around the area. Then came the HOA. My father never joined it because his property was outside the original subdivision boundaries. That never seemed to bother anyone. Until after he passed away. That's when everything changed. A few weeks after I inherited the property, an HOA representative came to my gate. She introduced herself as Linda Hayes, the association president. She told me the lake was a shared community amenity. I asked her where that was written. She said the HOA had managed the lake for years. I told her managing something wasn't the same as owning it. She didn't like that answer. 3 days later, I received the first violation notice. It demanded that I stop using the lake. No fishing, no dock repairs, no shoreline maintenance, and absolutely no private access. I called the county recorder and requested every document connected to the property. Then I found my father's original deed. The lake was clearly included in the parcel. There was no transfer to the HOA, no sale, no ownership agreement, nothing. I thought that would end the dispute. It didn't. The HOA president sent another letter claiming the lake had become part of the community through historical use. That phrase sounded ridiculous. But then something strange happened. It hadn't rained for weeks. The lake level dropped dramatically, and for the first time in decades, the old shoreline became visible. Mud gave way to grass. Grass gave way to an old stone boundary line, and near the eastern side of the lake, something even more important appeared. An old concrete marker. My father had told me about it years earlier. I just never understood what it meant. I called a surveyor. He came out with his equipment and spent nearly an entire day measuring the property. Then he compared the current shoreline with the original survey. That's when we discovered the problem. The lake had two very different water levels. At the normal level, it looked like one large body of water stretching toward the subdivision. But at the lower level, the original property boundary became visible. The HOA had been treating the entire expanded shoreline as if it were their property. But the historical boundary told a completely different story. The lower water level exposed what decades of rising and falling water had hidden. Old survey markers, an original drainage channel, and a strip of land that had never been transferred to the HOA. I took photographs. I collected the historical surveys, and I had the entire area professionally documented. That's when Linda called me. She sounded angry. She said I was creating unnecessary problems. I told her I wasn't creating anything. I was documenting what had always been there. She replied with a sentence that changed everything. Everyone knows that lake belongs to the neighborhood. I answered, everyone isn't the county recorder. She hung up. 2 days later, the HOA held an emergency meeting. Nearly 50 homeowners showed up. Linda stood at the front and claimed my family was trying to take away a community resource. Then she showed them photographs of the lake at its normal water level. From that angle, it looked convincing. The water covered the old boundary. The lake appeared continuous. But then I stood up. I had brought photographs from the low water period. I placed them beside the historical survey. Suddenly, the room became quiet. The two water levels told two completely different stories. At the high level, you couldn't see the original boundary. At the low level, you could. The water hadn't changed the property lines. It had simply hidden them. One homeowner asked Linda whether the HOA had a deed proving ownership. She said the association had historical records. Another homeowner asked whether those records actually transferred title. Linda couldn't answer. Then the HOA attorney looked at the survey. He studied it for several minutes. Finally, he admitted that the documents did not show the HOA on the land beneath the disputed shoreline. You could feel the mood in the room change. This wasn't about a community lake anymore. It was about an HOA claiming ownership over property that had never been transferred to them. But there was still one final question. What about the water itself? I didn't want to make the mistake of assuming that owning land automatically meant I could do anything I wanted with a water body. So I checked the applicable regulations. There were rules governing waterways, drainage, environmental work, and certain activities around water. Those rules mattered, but they were separate from the question of who owned the underlying property. That distinction ended the HOA's argument. They could point to regulations. They could discuss access. They could raise legitimate environmental concerns. But they couldn't simply declare my father's property theirs. A few weeks later, the HOA withdrew its ownership claim. They stopped sending violation notices, and they stopped telling residents that the entire lake belonged to the association. I didn't celebrate. Instead, I went back to the shoreline. The water had risen again. The old boundary disappeared beneath the surface. If you looked at the lake now, you would never know what had been revealed during those weeks of low water. But I knew, because I'd seen it. The markers, the old channel, the original boundary, everything my father had known decades before the HOA ever existed. That experience taught me something I'll never forget. Water can move. Shorelines can change. What you can see can disappear beneath the surface. But a property boundary doesn't move just because the water does. The HOA thought the lake's appearance proved their claim. Instead, the changing water levels exposed the truth. My father hadn't lost his lake. The HOA had simply never owned it. And sometimes, the strongest evidence isn't hidden in some complicated legal argument. Sometimes, you just have to wait for the water to go down. If you enjoyed this HOA story, like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from.